is we're going to talk about the history of the European Union. I'm going to do it through telling the story of me. And in the Second World War, I wasn't alive then, but my father was. He was a young soldier in the commandos, but he was actually a medical sergeant. And one of the stories he tells us is in a battle where there were a lot of British casualties and a lot of German casualties that all got mixed up. He managed to communicate with the German medics, even though they didn't really speak each other's language, and arranged that both sets of medics would bring the German wounded across to the German lines, and then then the other way around. And he always said he knew that, actually, although there was hostility underneath it, they really did realise that there were people on both sides. And of course, after the war, although there was still animosity, there was also a thirst for cooperation. Remember that straight after the war, Winston Churchill actually called for a United States of Europe. As prosperity began to come back, in 1952 there were two momentous events. One was I was born, and it was not a coincidence, because all over Europe, as we got more prosperity, parents were beginning to say, well, that's okay now, we can have children, so I'm part of a baby boom. The other thing that was born that year was the European Coal and Steel Community, which is the beginning part of the Common Market, or the European Union. And 1957, in comes the European, I'm going to call it the European Union, but really it's Common Market, European Community then. And Britain is not part of that. And you might think, well, maybe that was huge hostility in Britain, and it actually wasn't. It was more a sort of oversight, really, not realising that was going to be very, very significant. So you go through to the 1960s, and the British government realises that it's made a mistake and twice applies to join the European Union. And finally, just as I go to university, Britain does, in 1972, join the European Union. I remember we had to study it. It wasn't seen as particularly significant, but no particular hostility, no ideological debate, much to speak of. And then I become a teacher, or rather I trained to become a teacher. And Britain, of course, has to do things a peculiar way, and it's the only country that's joined the European Union and actually had the referendum afterwards. So in 1935, to settle the disputes in the Labour Party, they have a referendum just as I'm doing my teaching practice in Coventry College, and I'm given as my task to go and teach about the European Union to apprentices from British Lane and Motor Corporation. You can imagine that was not a very easy task. They did not really want to be there. But it's very interesting that there was again no great hostility to the European Union. I think in the end of the referendum they all voted for it because they thought it was going to bring prosperity. And then we go through to the 1980s, of course the era of Margaret Thatcher and the divisions there, but remember again, although she's noted for a great speech of saying we want our own money back from the European Union, she herself is perfectly in favour of Britain's membership for economic reasons. But the European Union is beginning to realise then there is opposition to the European Union. And so later that decade, they make available money to teach people about the European Union. And I'm by then working here at what is now University of Worcester. We were one of the first universities to apply for and get money to write and run modules about the European Union. We were allowed to be as critical as we wanted, we were, but students were interested and they signed up. Another sign is to go through to the 1980s. By then, of course, Britain looked particularly like opting out of things. The Maastricht Treaty in 1992, which eventually led to the Euro. It's obvious that Britain is not going to be part of that movement. I personally got a commission really from the London office of the European Commission to write a big report investigating the impact of the European Union in the southwest of England, and had to present that to a big press conference with a lot of big wigs from around the southwest in Bristol. And the reason I'm telling you that is simply because it's an awareness then that there's an issue, that they're losing people, the Bashford for people's minds. They're spending money on those kind of initiatives. I'm going to take you through pretty fast. There's the new Labour government from 1997. Obviously, they're not going to join the euro. With hindsight, the big significance, I think, is that a lot of the revolt against the European Union is actually a revolt against what some people see as a sort of liberal elite. And I personally would date that back to the new Labour government, when I think they were very much about giving permission to people to earn huge sums of money and rewarding them and so on. And then I'm going to jump very quickly to where we are now, missing out various bits, but when the referendum was mounted in Britain 3 years ago as to whether to stay in the European Union or not, it was pretty obvious early on that the people who wanted to come out of the European Union were making the running. And I thought, well, I want to be part of the other side. And I remember twice emailing one of the main organisations, the European Movement, to say, I'm a lecturer at university and I'll do anything, I'll write leaflets, I'll put them through doors, or I'll give talks. What was the reply? Nothing. I didn't get any response whatsoever. The thing was so badly organised. Eventually, locally, somebody asked if I would be the speaker in favour of remaining at the debate that was run in the little church just at the back of the university there. So me versus a former mayor, a former Conservative mayor. And it was really interesting because he was a nice guy, but he kept talking about things like unelected Brussels bureaucrats. And when challenged to say, can you just tell us how the European Union works? Why do you think it is unelected Brussels bureaucrats? He couldn't do it. It was just so ingrained, that kind of belief. And the audience, they were starting to ask questions about why is Turkey being allowed to join? And that was one of the things that UKIP had very successfully put worries among people's minds about that. There was never a prospect of Turkey being allowed to join, but it worked. And of course, like many people, on the morning after the referendum, I woke up about 4 o'clock and turned the radio on and discovered that the votes had gone 52% to leave the European Union and 48% to stay, very narrow, and was completely shocked. I'm not going to take the story on any further than that. We might have mounted discussion and questions, but I thought that might be a little run through of a potted history of me and the European Union. And still, then you get to go next.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Now, unlike Mike, I'm not going to take you through a personal story, but there will be a brief personal note embedded in what I'm going to say. I'm David Story. I'm a human geographer, and I've got interests in ideas of the nation and the sort of related ideas of borders and sovereignty. What I'm going to do is very briefly say something about each of those sort of three things, if you like, as they kind of pertain to ongoing developments in relation to the European Union and to Brexit. As well as the first thing to say is this whole idea of the nation is, in some respects, it's a very concrete concept. In other ways, it's incredibly nebulous. This idea of ideas of the nation are bound up with what people perceive themselves to be, and ideas of both self-identity and a broader collective identity. One of the issues, I suppose, within a UK context is what exactly is the nation? Because the United Kingdom is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We can therefore argue that what the United Kingdom is a state, which is a political entity, not the same as a nation, but it is a state that is composed of other nations, self-defined. So there are people who will define themselves as English, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, Northern Irish, whatever it might be, as well as numerous others from other places or with family connections to other places who will also define themselves in a whole range of different ethno-national define themselves in different ethno-national terms. Now, the closest you get, in a sense, to the equation between the UK as a state and national identity is the concept of Britishness, which again, there are differing takes clearly on that. However, however we define this nation, or set of nations, if you like, most nations, all nations in fact, are built on some set of myths. They may be built on some sense of history, but quite a lot of mythology. And most nations, all nations, are built on sort of setting themselves apart from others, which means there are certain national myths that are used to kind of reproduce that sense of nationhood, if you like. And you could argue that two that are of relevance in this particular context, well, there are several that are of relevance, but two are, one, the idea of national exceptionalism. In that sense, that Britain, stroke the UK, is different from the rest of Europe. And by definition, yes, it is. But every nation tells itself, or tells its citizens, that it's different. That's why it preserves its own sense and reproduces its own sense of distinctive nationhood. So that is of some significance, the notion that Britain isn't part of Europe. Well, geographically it is, but politically speaking, culturally speaking, the sense of trying to present itself as separate. The second myth that is of some direct relevance is, in some people's version of this, the notion of island nation. Slight problem here, in that there is an island that consists of Scotland, Wales, and England, but the UK state has jurisdiction over part of another island, namely Ireland. Which brings me to the second point, which is that of borders. And there's a curiosity in some ways that many people, certainly on this island, never seem to have occurred to them that when they voted in 2016, or those who encouraged people to vote in particular ways in 2016, forgot that the UK does actually have a land border with the European Union, and that land border is on the island of Ireland between the North and the Republic. The personal note is I grew up 4 miles from that border, and many people in the lead up to the referendum in 2016, there and elsewhere on the island of Ireland, were very much acutely aware that this might cause problems, which it now clearly is. There's a whole set of ramifications flowing from that. The third issue I wanted to just briefly refer to is the idea of sovereignty. Clearly sovereignty, and the whole issue of, if you like, reclaiming sovereignty that was allegedly lost, wasn't the only strand of the referendum debate leading up to the referendum, but certainly it was a dominant one. The idea of taking our country back, the idea of, also with the idea of securing borders and so forth. And in a sense, regardless of a couple of people voted out or in, there's a few myths surrounding sovereignty as well, and it's kind of it itself is a nebulous concept. It ain't clear cut, despite attempts by people like Nigel Farage to present sovereignty in a sort of either-or terms. You're either a sovereign nation state or you're not a sovereign nation state. It ain't like that, and it never has been. Sovereignty has always been contested. It's always contingent upon the context in which the time period in which we're talking about it, and so forth. There is a British geographer who based for many years at the University of California at Los Angeles, John Agnew, who many years ago, this is just one take on this, argued that you've got different forms of sovereignty. And he described them as sovereignty regimes. Two of those that are of relevance. One he referred to as the classic sovereignty regime, which is the one that most people think of. The state as the one and only supreme arbiter over everything that happens within its borders, and it has pretty much total control. That's never actually been absolute anyway, but insofar as it has, it's a kind of shifted over time. We can still argue there are countries that come close to that, and we could argue in the past the UK came close to that. Although ironically, in the case of the UK and many others that might be said to exhibit in the past symptoms of characteristics of classic sovereignty, in doing so, they were also usually empire builders who, in doing so, were actually removing sovereignty from other parts of the world. It's a curious paradox. Moving on, one of Agnew's other categories is that of integrated sovereignty. by which he really means where sovereignty is pooled between different political entities. And the European Union is a classic example of that, whereby, yes, it is correct to say that the UK and other member states cede a certain amount of sovereignty, but in a sense they've done so willingly and through a series of treaties, agreements, and so forth. It's not a case of losing sovereignty, it is simply a different form of sovereignty. Now, whether you regard that as a good thing or a bad thing is another matter, but it's not as simple as saying that we've lost our sovereignty, we need to reclaim it. If you're doing anything, it's about shifting the nature of that sovereignty, not an either-or scenario. And sort of, I suppose my final sort of closing point is that leads into what I think are quite misleading and potentially dangerous sort of notions of, you see, using hashtags like 31st of October will be Independence Day and so forth. And that is to misunderstand, it seems to me, what sovereignty is about, and hence to misunderstand, at least in part, the relationship between the UK, and not just the EU, but the UK and the wider world, where sovereignty in a global sense is very uneven, if you like. Some countries clearly have the power to exert a greater degree of sovereignty, if you like, than others. You can't compare the sovereignty enjoyed by the United States with that enjoyed by Mali or Malawi or whatever in terms of their power, if you like, both over their own territory and also upon the global stage. And also that's a whole notion of reclaiming independence and so forth. Not only is it misleading, I think it's potentially dangerous. I also think it's not just potentially, but it is kind of offensive to those who live in certain parts of the world and who've had their sovereignty very seriously affected, either presently or in the past, by, say, British rule, for example. So I think there needs to be a much clearer understanding of what we mean by that term. Thank you.
I'm Neil Fleming, I teach history here at Worcester, and my comments are really about the Conservative Party and Europe as an historian, and I've only really got 2 points I want to discuss. And one is about fundamentalism and its grasp of the Conservative Party, and the other is about the position of the Conservatives in Europe and how it's changed quite radically in the last few decades. Briefly on the fundamentalism, the problem of fundamentalism is one I'm sure we all can appreciate in the idea of believing there are fundamentals of belief. I think Brexit and even no deal Brexit in the last few months has become a fundamental tenet of the Conservative Party to the extent that ministers, former ministers, venerable members of the party have been expelled. There's a freezing out of people who don't agree with it from the parliamentary level and further down in the party. And this is curious, of course, because this fundamental is not a venerable one. It's not an old fundamental. If you go back even to the 80s, the free market von Hayek economics was the fundamental of the Conservative Party. And ironically, that led to things like the Single European Act. It led to the movement of peoples in Europe. So that was the new fundamentalism replaces the old fundamentalism. If you take it before that, to the 1930s through to the 60s, it was the Empire, or Empire Commonwealth, Commonwealth being a sort of friendly version, as so was presented, of imperialism. Before that, in the 19th century, it was about democracy, or actually anti-democracy, opposition to democracy. And in particular, if you go right back to the beginning of the 19th century, opposition to Catholicism in its political manifestations, and indeed the rights of Catholics to be members of the state. So if you look at any period in the history of conservatism in Britain, there's actually quite significant shifts in what those fundamental beliefs are. So if you take the 1920s and 30s, or say into the 1950s and 60s, the right wing of the party was viscerally hostile to non-white immigration to Britain. Now, there's survivors of that, but what's interesting, of course, is we have prominent members of the Conservative Party who are the children of some of those migrants who are adopting the new fundamental position, regardless of the older fundamental position. In the 1960s and 70s, a Catholic Conservative MP, John Biggs Davidson, was viscerally involved with supporting white rule in South Africa and Rhodesia. Yet by the older fundamentals of his own party, he should not even have a vote. He should not even be able to sit in Parliament. So the shifting fundamentalism in the Conservative Party involves a massive amount of forgetting what conservatism used to stand for. But what's interesting about that is they constantly say in promoting these fundamentalisms, this is what the party has always stood for. This is what we have always believed. historically speaking, that is blatantly untrue. The second thing I wanted to mention was the Conservative Party in Europe itself. I mentioned Biggs Davison. Biggs Davison was the chairman for a long time of something called the Monday Club, which some people might have heard of. Monday Club was a ginger group within the Conservative Party, which at its height in the early 70s had 30 odd MPs, six cabinet ministers. And they were all committed to supporting white rule in South Africa, white rule in what is today Zimbabwe, and then Southern Rhodesia, and opposed any sanctions against South Africa and against Southern Rhodesia. They all supported a policy of what they called voluntary repatriation of non-white citizens of his country to their places of origin in inverted commas. So, by any standards, we can say they're right-wing. What was their position in Europe? They were pro-EEC. And they were pro-EEC because they believed that it was the best way of organising Western Europe against the Communist East. And I think this Cold War context for the foundation of the European coal and steel community and later the economic community is forgotten because, of course, the Cold War is won. And we forget that important geopolitical context in which it emerged. Not only that, they were quite hostile. Biggs Davison himself was deeply hostile to the United States and wanted a European form of union or cooperation as a means of getting the US military out of Europe because he felt they were unreliable. So this is the right wing of the Conservative Party in the 1970s, the early 1970s, mid-1970s, under his particular leadership. Jonathan Guinness of the brewing family was also involved as chairman for a period of that time, another fellow Irishman. And they were pro-EC as a form of anti-communism, as a form of anti-Americanism. And you may say, where does this come from? The anti-Americanism comes from their imperialism. Die-hard British imperialists disliked the United States. They felt it was an unreliable ally. It had betrayed the British Empire in the First World War and indeed the Second World War. So, whilst it may sound strange to think of right-wing conservatives being anti-American, actually in the post-imperial context of the 1960s and 70s, again, something we all forget, because the empire's gone, the Cold War is gone, it made sense. When did that change? There was an attempt to change it in the early 1970s in the Monday Club, influenced in part by Enoch Powell's quite visceral anti-European speeches. But Powell was never a member of the Monday Club. However, the National Front looked at the Monday Club as a potential vehicle for itself to infiltrate the Conservative Party. And there were massive bust-ups within the Monday Club in the early 1970s, accusations of Nazis and neo-Nazis and National Front infiltration, and it sort of became a shadow of its former self by the late 70s, early 80s. But interestingly, in the early 1980s, the Monday Club, this vanguard of the right of the Conservative Party, changed its position in Europe. And part of the reason for that was a new context, which was Thatcherism. Part of the motivation among conservatives to support European membership of the European Economic Community was to find a way of curing Britain's economic ills. It didn't work out that way. It was quite a selfish reason to join the EEC, actually. I agree with Mike, there were some people who wanted to do it for idealistic reasons, but in terms of the Conservative Party, it was quite cold, calculating economic reasons. Britain's economy is not succeeding, maybe joining Europe will fix it. Of course, there's the Arab-Israeli war, there's the massive economic problems in the early 1970s. Not even the European Economic Community can fix these global economic problems. Thatcher and her various advisors and thinkers on economics began to supply an alternative economic cure as far as the right wing were concerned in Britain, which was the more purist free market idea. And the old imperialist right latched onto that by the early 1980s, which coincided with the tension over fisheries, and which became quite violent actually in the early 1980s in terms of British fishermen, trawlermen dealing with others, and naval involvement in that too. Something else happened around that time, which is a shift on the left of British politics. The left increasingly accommodated itself, not completely by any means, to seeing in Europe the potential for realising ideas that might be too difficult within the national political context. The small nation nationalists in the UK also changed their view by the early 1980s. Sinn Féin, Plaid Cymru, then the Scottish National Party, all in 1975 campaigned to get out of the EEC. It's funny when I hear the same parties talk today, they seem to forget their own histories. But in 1975 they campaigned to get out, but they had changed their mind on that again by the early 1980s, but particularly by the end of the 1980s. That's my cue to stop speaking, I think. But by the end of the 1980s, they changed their view because they felt that this Europe of regions that was much talked about might actually allow for Welsh nationalism, Scottish nationalism, and so on to flourish. So it's not just that the Conservatives changed their position in Europe around that pivot point of the early 1980s. The entire British political spectrum, if you will, changed its position gradually. What really has moved the Conservative Party, I would argue, to a much more fundamental position was losing not one, not two, but 3 general elections on the trot from 1997 onwards. And that does something to a political party. We know what it did to the Labour Party in the 1980s. Losing 3 general elections is 3 resounding rejections by the electorate, either by them not bothering to vote for you or by voting for another party, trying out the other guy. And I think in that period of opposition, the Conservatives were flailing around, not knowing quite what to do. Of course, Thatcher was in her strange form of semi-retirement, sometimes speaking, sometimes pronouncing, but anointing her successors, so they all played against one another. And Europe became the thing that they could all latch on to. Save the Parliament, we remember from the very early point. But that deepened in the party. And the leaders who sought election, their fidelity to Euroscepticism was often the main testing point. Not the position on the NHS, not the position on education or any of these issues, but Europe. And in the opposition, of course, it became obsessive, because they didn't have the levers of government, they didn't have the patronage of the government, and so this ideological fidelity, which we saw in Labour in the early 1980s, comes to affect the Conservative Party in more recent years. Now, Cameron, of course, came in seeking to purify the party, to purify the fire of Cameronism. Well, he was a PR man, he did a very good job of presenting a new face to the Conservative Party. People I knew who hated the Conservative Party even said, well, he's not too bad. So he certainly did a good job of presenting a new face. Huskies and hugging hoodies, not hugging Huskies, of course. Important to keep those two separate. Now, the Cameron project, of course, came apart. We all knew, we all lived through why it came apart. He lived through all of these things, most of these things I've been mentioned, and he actually, I think, genuinely believed he could lance the boil up until he called it, and then, so he says in the documentary I watched last night, then he realised it somehow was out of his control. But I do think he did think he could lance this boil once and for all. The irony, as we all appreciate, and you hardly need me to tell you, is this is probably going to be around for a generation. Even if Brexit is fixed, your position within Conservatism, or a party which may even replace the Conservative Party, the New Conservatives, the New, or whatever, if the Conservative Party was to fragment, what you did in 2016, what you did in 2019 will matter in future generations. I say that because in the 1960s, when people were campaigning to be leader of the Conservative Party, what they did in Munich in 1938 was brought up in Conservative Party hustings in the early 1960s. Did you support appeasement of Nazi Germany, or were you against them? And that mattered. So these things last. What you did back then will last as long as a political generation remains in the party. That's all I have to say. I think we said we'd take questions if people have contributions.
So, you don't really want to, haven't you?
When you say in the run-up to the referendum, there was no prospect of Turkey joining the EU, do you play down historical events or historical events that were actually happening at the time which make people think that we could have a large influx of people from Turkey? So a month before the referendum, we had the EU talking about visa-free access to the EU Turkish system.
I totally accept what you said there, but I think it's interesting to look at the Turkey have been making applications to join what is now the European Union for over 3 decades, 3.5 actually, and so it wasn't something new that came up, and it was just produced at just the right time, about 10 days, I think, before the referendum. So there was clearly a political motive for doing that. And those people who were inside the working on the European Union were absolutely clear there was nothing like a majority backing for allowing the Turkish application to proceed. For all kinds of reasons. I mean, it's about human rights, it's about all kinds of things like that. And in a way, to be honest, the people who were supporters of Brexit were so clever. I mean, they were just brilliant at almost every single thing they did. That was the one that surprised me, because, you know, in a sense, it has very little directly to do with Britain, and yet it had resonance on the doorsteps, apparently. Even if you're right, and there was a bit of a difference there, it was very surprising to me that came up and became one of the key issues in that last week, just before people were voting. Hand it to them, the people supporters of Brexit did a blinder, and they've done a blinder in the last few months as well, actually, I have to say, unfortunately.
And do you think migration was more important than sovereignty that they now flip?
Yeah, I mean, migration is obviously quite a concern of many people, but it's actually the consequences of migration that very often is what people are bothered about. I mean, in the east of England, they were bothered about the fact that as the population was growing a bit because of the industries there, the agriculture and so on, needing labour from other countries, the British government have just not done anything about provision for schooling and better transportation and health and so on. So they were actually seeing the consequences of that. I think it's that really was the big thing that really worried people, rather than necessarily that we have people now in our midst who come from different backgrounds. I may be wrong about that, but I think that's probably the most salient.
I think just to carry on from that, the whole migration issue was certainly a factor in the Brexit vote. Now, I don't for a minute believe that everybody who voted to leave the EU is a racist, anti-migrant xenophobe. There's all sorts of complex reasons why people voted. But it did have a certain resonance, and it probably did in some places more than others. Though the geography of that's not consistent either. You had a very high exit vote in places with very low rates of immigration, for example. And in some of the most multicultural and places with high levels of immigration, you had a clear vote to stay, so clearly much of London, for example. So you can't totally pin this down. There's no doubt that the way in which UKIP at the time played upon this notion of hordes of migrants and so forth did play a role. But I think Mike's right in the sense that there are certainly issues to do with infrastructure and support. But there's also, migrants, I'm a migrant. Migrants go to places, usually, not always, for economic reasons. You're going because there are jobs, and you're going to fill probably particular niches within the labour market, and by and large, that's what happens. Rates of migration slow down, in-migration slow down as economic problems ensue. That's pretty much a general rule across the board. So, by and large, the evidence suggests in terms that migration wasn't having a negative impact upon wages, though that does vary a little bit depending upon the particular sector or profession. Certainly, there's a certain issue among certain forms of unskilled work. But migrants, to an extent, are filling particular niches within the labour market, service sector, and certainly agriculture and agricultural food processing sectors, for example. So it did play a role, but it's not the only thing that played a role. And it's surprisingly easy to then play upon particular fears, and there certainly has been and continues to be a stoking up of racism and xenophobia, which is very, very ugly for all sorts of obvious reasons, and based by and large on a set of myths surrounding that. One of the things that sort of kind of really annoys me is that no matter how much you repeat this to some people, they still will tell you, oh, this, there's millions of people here, I've had people say to me, oh, you barely hear English spoken on the high street in Worcester anymore. I mean, this is nonsense. But yet people believe it. So in the minds of some people, those myths have a strong resonance. But I don't for a minute believe that is simply the only factor, or that that's what everybody believes.
Can I add in just less than 60 seconds, one tiny little bit to support that? I come from North Staffordshire and was born just over the border from Stoke-on-Trent, which 3 years ago became known as Brexit City because it actually had the highest vote of that kind of area anywhere in Britain against the European Union. Stoke-on-Trent has got an extremely depressed economy. It has also got the lowest number, the sort of proportion of migrants of any place in the Midlands. And what's happened, of course, is the industries have collapsed, the pottery industry collapsed, the coal industry collapsed. Basically, they feel forgotten, and they feel got by people out there. And it's whether it's London or whether it's European Union, not quite clear. But it's certainly not, although the discussion was all about migration, actually it had no direct effect on, a little direct effect on Stoke-on-Trent, and yet they voted in very large numbers to come out of the European Union.
The other thing to just bear in mind about this, it's that notion in the sense that for some people, and for some political provocateurs, if you want to put it that way, migrants are easily scapegoatable. There's a particular set of problems, then you've got an identifiable group of people who live. But there's nothing, sadly, new in that. There's an excellent book by a guy called Robert Winder called Bloody Foreigners, which traces, it's not particularly academic, but it traces the history of immigration into Britain. And migrants have always been scapegoated, particularly in times of economic depression and so forth. The only difference, and forms of scapegoating are usually the same: health risks, risk to jobs, and risk to culture. The only difference over time is the specific target group varies. It was the Irish in the late 19th, early 20th century. It's people from the West Indies and the Caribbean in the 1950s, through to, from India, Pakistan, 60s, 70s, through to Polish people, Slovakians and so forth from 2004 onwards. So there's a continuing trend of scapegoating particular groups for what are actually genuine structural problems within society. At least that's what I think.
I say as an irony, as a historian, about Turkey's role in the, particularly among the UKIP campaign, is that Turkey was, historically speaking, 19th century Britain's ally, and without Turkey, Britain could never have had its empire in India. Its empire in the east of Suez was reliant upon Turkish goodwill over the Egypt land, and later the canal route through there. So I think Disraeli would be spinning in his grave if he heard the way Turkey was being used, since Turkey was so strategically important to the British and their empire. I think, though, generally what comes through to me is lack of information, and the Greek government is the reason Turkey, I think, will never join the European Union, because the Greek-Turkish crisis has never been resolved in the early 1920s. Cyprus remains divided, therefore Turkey will never join. That's the reason, that's the hard, cold diplomatic reason it'll not join. But how much do we know about Greek politics or anything really beyond Western Europe? And that's obviously something we need to think about. In recent debates, the issue about the referendum, I went to the Robin Walker event, and the question was about was the referendum binding legally? The trouble is, if you have a mass vote, it doesn't really matter in that sense. It's the moral weight of the vote and the moral authority then it carries. And I think Parliament has struggled with that ever since, because Britain is a parliamentary democracy in which referendums don't happen. Though, interestingly, right-wing conservatives in the past toyed with the idea of referendums. In 1910, 1911, those who wanted to keep the powers of the House of Lords intact so the peers could veto any legislation from the elected chamber, thought maybe if we go to the people will back us. Because the people, this is in the letters, you can read the letters in the British Library Archive, the people are conservative. So there was a conviction among some of the most stalwart right-wingers in the Conservative Party before the First World War, not the 70s, not in the last few years, long before Dominic Cummings was ever invented, that the public were fundamentally right-wing, or at least patriotic, as they would use the language. They were patriotic. So it is interesting that the referendum has, in a sense, delivered this right-wing conservative aim or ambition in a way that other things like elections to the national parliament, the devolved assemblies, and other fora has never delivered. The referendum has delivered that. And I think that we should, while everyone's talking about rewriting the constitution, rather than start from scratch, maybe we should really ask ourselves whether referendum are useful devices, given the absolute chaos of this last one.
Can I add in that that's why David Cameron was prepared to concede the referendum, because he actually had two, and he won both of them. One in the northeast of England was to whether to have a regional assembly, which they didn't want, and his side won that one. But I don't know if you realise the referendum in Scotland was not the result of the Scottish National Party pressure. They didn't want one at that stage. David Cameron determined it and thought he could win it, and he did. He actually managed to keep Scotland in the United Kingdom. So having won two, I don't think there's any doubt that David Cameron thought, right, well, we can win this one as well.
Simon, were you good too?
Yeah, I was going to make a theoretical point about fundamentalism as a sort of discursive practice, which occurred to me when Neil was talking about fundamentalism. And that is that my understanding is that it's where you refer to a fixed point in the past, usually a biblical or religious text, which then has to inform your conduct in the present. Only the problem is the fixed point in the past is past and doesn't directly speak to the present circumstances. Therefore, there has to be a process of interpretation. So fundamentalism is about sticking to the rule which was set in the past, codified in the past, but then having to interpret how that applies to the present. So there's a sort of disclaimer of the process of interpretation. It seems to me in a way that this is what's happening with the referendum, that the 52-48 vote in the referendum is a sort of fundamentalist point that has to be observed, no matter what. But of course, we don't really know exactly what that vote meant, because it then has to be interpreted. Does it mean leaving all of the institutions or some of the institutions? What happens when circumstances change? What happens if public opinion changes, and so on? So there's a sort of parallel.
Right. You're right, but the fixed point in the past that you choose to gaze at shifts. So you're right about interpretation, but it shifts to different things. The one that came up certainly when Boris Johnson had his rival speech when Theresa May was in the conference chamber. I think it was the year where everything didn't go terribly for her, and Boris Johnson was in a rival venue in Manchester. He referred to the Second World War. We can do it. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Britain never stood alone against Nazi Germany. First of all, the empire which Britain, for ill or for good or ill, stood alongside Britain against an empire. That included 2 million Indian men in the armed forces, something, again, people forget when we talk about race and immigration and so forth. Let alone many contributions from African, Canadian, West Indian, Australasian soldiers, let alone the other European volunteers and armies that were also against Nazi Germany. But that myth is very, very powerful, but it's based on it's not just a point of view, it's a fundamental misunderstanding about what actually happened in the Second World War. So fundamentalism, you're right, it's about interpretation, but it's willful misinterpretation, I would say, and it's almost necessary, because you drew the religious analogy. I think that is telling, because it almost becomes about belief. It doesn't matter, it's the belief, it's the faith that matters, not the actual thing that you believe in. Right.
No, it's okay. I agree with Neil. In fact, preempted something I was going to say, but it's, you're talking about sort of fundamentalism. Nations themselves rest upon a series of what seem to be fundamental myths, but those myths alter over time, and that notion of the Second World War standing alone, or wars and standing alone, is one of those sort of classic ones that is a myth to start with, but then takes hold. But the other thing, when you mentioned about the referendum itself and the 52-48 becoming sort of that article of faith or whatever. First of all, of course, there is the key problem that it was so close. You could argue, had it been somewhere in the region of 60-40, then yeah, it might have been different. But allied to that is that one of Neil's earlier points is the notion of the people have spoken. Yeah, they've spoken in a very ambiguous way, which now creates that set of problems. It's highly unlikely that they actually meant a no-deal Brexit if they meant Brexit at all. So, I mean, if you want to get into the notion of whether referenda are a good thing or not, and I come from a country where we have them every 6 months, but they actually tend to be more prepared for them for that reason. But I think one of the key problems is in a country that doesn't have a history of them, it then became, the result was the opposite of what most people thought and was dangerously close. You could argue the way around that would have been to kind of say any referendum must have something like a 2/3 majority for it to alter the status quo, which might have resolved that issue. By the way, I'm very dubious about a second referendum because you may well end up with the same result the other way around. And there is an argument that then itself, there is a huge question here over democracy in this country, not just over the antics of Boris Johnson, but over what happens now. And we're not in a good place.
We ought to reconvene in 2 years' time, and assuming Britain and the University of Worcester still exists, I think. We haven't got a chair, so we haven't got anybody to say it's over. So
Yeah, someone tells us to go, we'll shut up.
we all just play. That's a good way of doing it. We can give her a break. We give you a